The landlord said get out by sundown. The carpenter said she is not going anywhere. The notice was nailed to the door at 7 in the morning, before the bakery below had opened, before the street had filled with carts and voices, before Dorothea Pell had finished her coffee. It was tacked to the door of the room above the bakery on 2nd Street in Harlan, Missouri, and it said what notices of this kind always say, that the tenant was behind on rent, that the landlord's patience was exhausted, that the premises were to be vacated by sundown, or the sheriff would be summoned to assist with the vacating. The notice was signed by Roland Witt, who owned the building and the bakery beneath it, and 3 other buildings on 2nd Street, and who managed his properties with the philosophy that sentiment was a poor substitute for payment. He had been a landlord for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had evicted 14 tenants, and not one of those evictions had cost him a minute of sleep, because Roland Witt did not lose sleep over business decisions. And everything, in Roland Witt's estimation, was a business decision, and that mercy, while admirable in Scripture, had no place in the rental business. The tenant was Dorothea Pell. She was 27, originally from Sedalia, a dressmaker by trade and by temperament, and she owed Roland Witt $12 in back rent, which was 2 months' worth at $6 a month, which was the rate Witt charged for a room that was 12 feet by 14 feet, with a window that did not open, and a stove that barely worked, and a door that did not lock properly, deficiencies that Witt had promised to repair when she moved in, promises he had made while showing her the room, with the particular enthusiasm of a man who wants a lease signed, and who knows that promises made before a signature carry no weight after it. The deficiencies remained unrepaired 14 months later, because Witt's promises, like his properties, were maintained only to the minimum standard necessary to avoid legal consequences. Dorothea read the notice twice. She read it standing in the hallway with her sewing basket in one hand, and the particular stillness of a woman who has been expecting bad news and is now receiving it, and is deciding, in the space between the reading and the response, how much of herself she is willing to surrender to the fear that the bad news produces. She decided none. She had been poor before. She had been frightened before. She had been told to leave places before. But she had never been wrong before, and that was the difference. Because a woman who is wrong can be moved, but a woman who is right plants her feet. The problem was not that Dorothea could not pay. The problem was that Dorothea could not pay Witt, because Witt had raised the rent from $4 to $6 3 months ago without the 30 days notice that the rental agreement required, and Dorothea had continued paying $4 on principal, and the difference, $2 a month for 3 months, had accumulated into the $12 debt that Witt was now using as grounds for eviction. The principle was sound. The principle was also, in a town where the landlord was wealthy and the tenant was a dressmaker, functionally irrelevant, because principle without power is a noble sentiment with no enforcement mechanism. She went to see Witt. She walked to the office he kept in the building at the corner of 2nd and Main, a building that was nicer than any of the buildings he rented, because the maintenance standards a man applies to his own property are always higher than the standards he applies to the properties he rents to others. She stood in his office and made her argument: the rental agreement, the 30-day notice requirement, the illegal increase. And Witt listened with the expression of a man hearing a language he does not speak and has no intention of learning. "The rent is $6, he said. You owe $12. Pay by sundown or vacate, those are the options. The rent is $4 according to the signed agreement. You raised it without notice. The increase is not legal. Miss Pell, I own the building. I set the rent. The agreement says I may adjust for market conditions. Market conditions have adjusted. Market conditions have not changed. The building has not changed. The only thing that has changed is your desire to charge more for a room whose window does not open and whose door does not lock. Then find another room. There are no other rooms. You own every rental property on 2nd Street. That is not my problem. Your rent is my problem. Pay it or leave." Dorothea left the office without another word, because there were no other words that would matter in that room with that man. She walked down 2nd Street in the direction of her building, passing the bakery and the general store and the feedlot and the carpenter's shop. And at the carpenter's shop she stopped, not because she had planned to stop, but because the carpenter was standing in the doorway and the carpenter had heard the conversation. because Witt's office had thin walls, and the carpenter's shop was next door, and sound travels through thin walls the way water travels through cracks, completely. The carpenter's name was Owen Dahl. He was 32, broad-shouldered, with sawdust in his hair and on his sleeves, and permanently embedded in the creases of his hands that were large and scarred, and capable of the kind of precise work that makes furniture, and the kind of rough work that builds houses, and the kind of gentle work that he had not had occasion to perform, because his life, to this point, had been mostly about the first two kinds. He had come to Harlan from a town in Iowa that no longer needed a carpenter, because the railroad had bypassed it and the population had halved, and in the 3 years since his arrival, he had built furniture and cabinets and occasionally framed houses. And he had built a reputation for honest work and fair prices, and the particular reliability that comes from being a man who says what he will do and then does it, which in Harlan, as in most towns, was a rarer quality than it should have been. He lived alone above the shop, kept his accounts in a ledger that was always current, attended church on Sundays without calling attention to himself, and was known to extend credit to families who needed furniture and could not pay all at once, a practice that cost him money and earned him something that money could not purchase, which was the trust of people who had been given no reason to trust anyone. He had heard the conversation with Witt. He had heard Dorothea's argument, which was correct, and Witt's response, which was not, and he had felt the particular anger that honest people feel when they witness dishonesty being wielded as power, an anger that is not explosive but structural, built into the bones of a person who believes that agreements should be honored and that power should not be used to punish people who insist on the honoring. Miss Pell. Dorothea stopped. She looked at the carpenter with the expression of a woman who is managing several things simultaneously: anger, fear, dignity, and the practical question of where she will sleep tonight, and who does not have bandwidth for a conversation that is not directly relevant to one of those things. The May sun was behind her, and the street was dusty, and somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at a wagon. Mr. Dahl, I heard your conversation with Witt. The walls are thin. They are. Your argument is correct. The increase is not legal without 30 days written notice. I know this because Witt raised my rent last year under the same terms, and I reviewed the agreement with the attorney in Jefferson City. What did the attorney say? The attorney said the increase was unenforceable. Witt backed down. He backed down because the attorney sent a letter, and letters from attorneys have a weight that words from tenants do not. I cannot afford an attorney. No, but you can afford a carpenter who knows an attorney and who is willing to stand next to you when you tell Witt that his notice is unlawful and that if he wants to evict you, he will need to do it through the courts, which will cost him more than $12 and which will expose his illegal practices to a judge who may have opinions about landlords who raise rents without notice. Dorothea looked at Owen Dahl. She looked at him the way a person looks at an unexpected ally, with gratitude and suspicion in equal measure, because unexpected allies are rare, and the rarity makes them suspect. Why? She asked. Because Witt is wrong, and because wrong men with power do not stop being wrong unless someone with different power stands in the way. I have a shop next to his office, and a lease that he cannot break, and that gives me standing, and standing is what you need. They went to see Witt together. Dorothea did not ask Owen if he was certain. Owen did not ask Dorothea if she was ready. They were both certain, and both ready, and both tired of watching a man with power use it badly. They walked the 50 yards from the carpenter's shop to Witt's office, and Owen Dahl stood beside Dorothea Pell in the same office where she had stood alone an hour earlier. And the dynamics of the room changed the way dynamics change when a second person enters. Not because Owen was physically imposing, though he was, but because the presence of a witness transforms a private conversation into a public one, and public conversations hold people to different standards than private ones. Mr. Witt, Owen said, Miss Pell's rental agreement specifies $4 a month. You raised the rent without the required 30 days written notice. The increase is unenforceable. I have discussed this with an attorney in Jefferson City, who will confirm it in writing if you require confirmation. Witt looked at Owen. He looked at him with the expression of a man who has been playing a game he is accustomed to winning and has just discovered that the rules have changed because someone who knows the rules has entered the game. This is not your concern, doll. It is my concern as a tenant, and as a neighbor, and as a man who believes that agreements should be honored. Miss Pell owes you nothing. The rent is $4. She has paid $4 every month. If you wish to raise the rent, you may do so with 30 days written notice, as the agreement requires, and the increase will take effect 30 days from the date of that notice. Until then, the eviction notice on her door is without legal basis, and if the sheriff is summoned, he will be summoned to enforce an unlawful action, which is something neither you nor the sheriff will want to explain to a judge. The room was quiet. Whit sat behind his desk and looked at Owen, and then at Dorothea, and then at his hands, which were softer than Owen's hands, and had built nothing except a portfolio of rental properties and a reputation for squeezing tenants. The quiet lasted long enough for everyone in the room to understand that the outcome had been decided, and that the deciding had happened not through violence or threat, but through the simple application of knowledge to power, which is the most effective tool in a carpenter's shop, and in a landlord's office, and in every room where one person is trying to take from another person something that does not belong to him. $4, Whit said, effective immediately. I will provide 30 days' notice of any future adjustment. And the door and the window, Dorothea said. The door does not lock and the window does not open. The agreement requires habitable conditions. Whit looked at her. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has lost a negotiation and is now being asked to concede additional ground, and is discovering that the ground he is being asked to concede is ground he should have conceded months ago. I will send someone to fix them. Send him, Dorothea said, nodding toward Owen. He is a carpenter. He is standing right here, and his work, unlike your promises, actually gets done. Owen fixed the door that afternoon. He fixed the window the next morning. He fixed them with the same careful attention he gave to furniture and cabinets, and the fine dovetail joints that no one ever saw, but that held the drawers together for decades, measuring twice, cutting once, making sure the work would last. The door locked properly, for the first time in 14 months. The window opened to let in the May air, and Owen Dahl, standing in Dorothea Pell's room above the bakery, with his tools in his hands and sawdust on his sleeves, realized that the work he had done, the standing beside her, the speaking for the agreement, the fixing of the door and the window, was the third kind of work, the gentle kind, the kind he had not had occasion to perform, and the performing of it had changed something inside him that he had not known was waiting to be changed. Dorothea made him supper as payment for the repairs. The supper became a habit. The habit became evenings on the stairs behind the bakery, talking about wood and fabric, and customers who did not know what they wanted, and the particular satisfaction of making things with your hands, of starting with raw material and ending with something that had not existed before, and that would outlast the hands that made it, which was something they shared, and which connected them in a way that did not require explanation, because the connection was in the hands themselves, and in the work the hands did. They married in September, in the carpenter's shop, because Owen said that a man should be married in the place where he does his best work, and Dorothea said that a woman who had been saved by a carpenter might as well be married by one too. Owen had built the bench they stood before, and the shelves on the wall behind them held the tools he used every day, and the sawdust on the floor was fresh, because he had been working that morning, and saw no reason to stop working, just because he was getting married. The minister who performed the ceremony said later that it was the only wedding he had ever conducted where the groom had sawdust in his hair, and the bride had thread on her sleeve, and neither of them minded. Whit sent the 30-day notice in November, raising the rent to $5. Dorothea and Owen reviewed it, confirmed it met the terms of the agreement, and paid the $5 without complaint, because the principle had never been about the money. It had been about the agreement, about the notion that a signed document means something, and that the words inside it are not decorations, but obligations. And the agreement was finally being honored, and the honoring was worth every dollar and every hour and every difficult conversation of the fight. Owen built a cradle that winter, from black walnut he had been seasoning for 2 years, and when Dorothea asked him what it was for, he said it was for the future, And Dorothea said the future would need a cradle that size in about 7 months. And Owen, who was not a man given to large displays of emotion, set down his chisel and crossed the shop and held her, and did not say anything, because some things do not require words, and this was one of them.